Hello and welcome to Japan Expert Insights and our Wednesday morning room with Tim Sullivan and me, Maya Matsuoka, as your hosts and moderators. In this podcast, we welcome comments, questions, and opinions. So if you haven't done so yet, join us next time on Clubhouse. In the meantime, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload all the conversations on Japanese politics, business insights, and Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific region. It's 8 o'clock and we can officially open the room. So thank you very much for coming, everybody. Good morning. Today we have a special guest again. So his name is Dean Gum, and he has a long career in the logistics industry. And we all know that while the pandemic has disturbed many things around the world, supply chains and other industries as well. The logistics industry has been suffering as well because of disruptions. And today we're going to hear what the disruptions are from Dean. Of course, there are challenges, there are things that go well and things that don't go well. But without any further ado, Dean, could you please introduce yourself briefly, and then let's hear what you have prepared to tell us.
Yes, thank you. And again, Maya, thank you so much for inviting me to join your clubhouse today. I am absolutely delighted. Now, a little bit of information about myself. Hopefully, the audience can detect my accent. So I'm Australian, born in Australia, and I still currently reside in Sydney, Australia. So just a little bit of perspective there. For reference, as Maya mentioned, I've been in the logistics industry. Actually, I've been working for FedEx for just on 31 years now, as of September 2nd. So definitely had a bit of experience there. So I thought I'd share a little bit about my story, especially what's the relationship to Japan and my personal interests. And of course, as Maya mentioned, what's been happening in the logistics industry, especially due to the last couple of years, of course, to the pandemic. And hopefully I can share some tips as well about anyone wanting to do business, whether it's importing or exporting from Japan. I do have a bit of a focus on the Australia-Japan trade lane, but hopefully I can also share some general tips to give the audience a few ideas. So allow me to share some more about myself. I mentioned I live in Australia. I was born in Australia, in fact, in Darwin, the Northern Territory. So that's the very top end of Australia. I was actually about 7 at the time. This is quite a while ago. It was Christmas Eve, 1974, and we had a big cyclone. It was Cyclone Tracy that hit Darwin at the time. Effectively, the whole town was completely devastated. It was one of the first major natural disasters that impacted, I guess, civilized towns or developed towns in Australia. Shortly after, our family relocated to Sydney, where I have grown since. And again, there's a song I remember that was made up at the time, something to the tune of Santa never made it to Darwin, at least for that year. So that's my most vivid memory as a child. And a little bit of a coincidence, my parents, they were also born and bred in Darwin. Their grandparents actually came from southern China, migrating to Australia. They were actually evacuated. This was their second evacuation after the cyclone. The first evacuation was during the war to clear the Darwin area of the civilians as such. But anyway, coming back to, I guess first I thought I'd share a little bit about my exposure to Japan, but also then the logistics industry as such. So this was in my late teens. I was introduced to Japanese martial arts, and quite exciting for myself. But that was also the very first time I was introduced to Japanese cuisine, particularly sushi. And as soon as I tasted that, fell in love straight away. And just briefly, I guess everyone can relate, I hope, to the very first time they experienced wasabi. So imagine, I was just a teenager trying to stay cool and learning from my martial arts instructors. We went to dinner, watching them, mixing that wonderful, mysterious green paste with the soy and dipping the sushi and eating so casually. Imagine myself trying to stay so calm and collected, but that first taste experience and the following sinus explosion, that was definitely a memory for me. Okay, so moving on. After my education, I had done a bit of a whirlwind tour, traveling through the United States. I remember I went through Los Angeles and Nevada at that time, and a short stint through Europe as such. Returning back home, looking for a job, I saw in a local newspaper a company mentioning travel benefits. So that got me interested straight away. The company name was Federal Express, and to be totally honest, I had no idea what that meant. My first thought was it was something to do with fast banking. But then my father explained a little bit about that, and he kind of reassured me that it's a good company to go with. But either way, the travel benefits got my interest. So this was back in the early 90s. Federal Express, or it's now known as FedEx, is the current brand name. Imagine at the time, coming into Sydney, Australia, we were operating cargo aircraft, and at that stage, these were 747 aircraft. So, everyone can imagine what a 747 looks like, but from a cargo plane, imagine the whole hull itself completely empty, and it's just the deck for cargo to be put in. In the upper deck of the 747 was actually like a crew rest area where you can imagine very comfortable leather lounges or sofas, which were for the crew. So the reason I mentioned that is, in those days, when I joined the company, the travel benefit was, as an employee of Federal Express, we could travel on the cargo flights. That was referred to as jump seating or deadheading in the industry. What it meant was we could fly for free. So straight away, imagine for a young traveller, definitely that was an absolute benefit. One of my first trips from Sydney, I went to the United States. But the trip routing, our flight from Sydney flew to Taipei, stayed overnight, transiting via Tokyo, and then on to Anchorage and connecting into the US network. So imagine all of those flights absolutely free. We did, of course, have to qualify for certain safety checks as such. But the other memorable experience was in Tokyo. We were served a crew meal, and I do remember it was a large white box full of various sushi. And imagine, unlike a passenger flight where there's a set time for the meals and the flight attendants, of course, serving everyone, on these cargo flights, there are no flight attendants. It's all do it yourself. But then you can eat in your own time. So imagine being able to sleep, lie back in those leather lounge chairs, wake up, eat as much sushi as I want, and then go back to bed again. That was a highlight. I definitely enjoyed that one. I guess moving forward a little bit, those times have changed. So imagine with the increased security, especially with the world incidents over the past couple of decades, jump seating is no longer available, unfortunately, but definitely was an absolute benefit. One thing I just wanted to add as well is even if we were approved to board a flight, the captain always had the final say for whatever reason. So the captain had the final discretion to bump any of the travellers off the flight for whatever reasons. And that actually nearly happened to myself coming back from the States. The flight stopped in Hawaii for a refuel. Apparently the flight was full, and the captain told the ramp agents, the handling staff, that I had to be kicked off the flight. Now, in those days, I had a pretty good holiday. I literally had no money left at all. And I remember telling the ramp staff in Hawaii, unless I can get on that flight, I'm going to be living in the office until the next flight comes in, which in those days was a few days later. Anyway, thankfully, the ramp staff were able to negotiate, get myself on the flight and back home safe. I guess in hindsight, and also coming to know Tim Sullivan as well, I was also thinking, what if I had the chance to stay in Hawaii a few more days? I think that would have been a good adventure as well. Okay, so moving on. So that's a little bit about myself and the company and traveling as such. A little bit more about my connection with Japan. That may help as well. So I had joined our company in the early 90s. By about the mid-90s, I joined the IT team. It was called Customer Technology. Imagine we were responsible, I was the only employee at the time, responsible for implementing shipping systems for our customers across Australia and New Zealand. So imagine in those days, early 90s, there was no such thing as internet, no World Wide Web. I think even Windows at that stage had only just started to be rolled out, one of the early platforms of Windows. So our main shipping application was MS-DOS. So it was all text-based, and we had to provide bulky dot matrix printers. And in terms of data connectivity, it was all via modem dial-up. So imagine piggybacking off fax lines for the modem transmissions. And the technology in those days, it was all floppy disk. So from what I heard recently, there's still some groups, I think possibly government in Japan, still using floppy disks or talking about phasing that out. But yeah, in those days, that was our technology. Now, about Japan, one of the IT managers, Japan-based at the time, actually offered me a job. He actually asked if I'd like to work for him in Tokyo. The funny thing is, he actually said, whatever you're being paid now, Dean, I will make it 3 times your current salary. So that sounds pretty good. But I was quite naive at the time. I didn't speak the language, so I simply just said, I think that's a great offer, but perhaps the cost of living is also 3 times, if not more, compared to Sydney. The manager, I think he said that's probably true, but he also said in terms of the language, nothing to worry about. You'll get by fine. No need to worry about speaking Japanese. So I guess that's a quick question I have for Maya or even the audience. For those who may have lived in Japan in the 90s, would the cost of living, especially in Tokyo, been so expensive? And then the other question, similarly, is for a foreigner, would the language barrier have been a significant issue in those days? It'd be interesting to know what people's perspectives are at that point in time. Now, moving forward, around 2013, 2019, I took a role as a sales facilitator. In short, it was conducting sales training for our teams in the Asia-Pacific region. So a lot of traveling, a lot of flights, especially Shanghai, Guangzhou, Bangkok. But I was also fortunate to have a workshop I was invited to support in Tokyo. And in those days back home, when I wasn't traveling, I recall flicking through the TV channels, and I came across this station. It was NHK World, and there was an episode about journeys in Japan. And I remember Mount Aso in Kyushu being featured. That straight away caught my interest, and soon after I was watching NHK World. Imagine this is the international broadcast. That became my number one channel of choice, and really kind of sparked a lot of interest in the cuisine, the culture, also the travels. So in fact, imagine my colleagues at the time were from the Asia Pacific area. A few were from Japan, so naturally befriended them. And from late 2014 up to early 2020, so January 2020, I had managed to arrange 13 trips, all holidays, including the one short work trip to Japan. And so those were great days for me. I absolutely loved the travel. I managed, definitely with the JR Rail Pass, right, so pretty much access anywhere on the JR network. I was able to get as far north on the main line up to, in Akadate in Aomori to see the rice paddy art. That was quite a highlight. And as far south, one of my other preferred locations is Kagoshima, for which tuning into the clubhouse with Diane last week, that was quite enjoyable to learn about, a bit about the history of Kagoshima as well. And another highlight, travelling further south from Kagoshima, maybe just over an hour's train ride, is Ibuski for the sandbars. So these were really unique experiences for me. In fact, the last time I was in Japan, it was for New Year, January 2020. I was in Miyazaki, so in Kyushu, for the New Year with my girlfriend at the time. And I think if everyone can imagine, as the sun rises, especially over the Pacific Island, I summed up the courage. This was planned. So as the sun rose, I proposed to my now fiance. Fortunately, we're still in that situation. She's in Taiwan at the moment, so Taiwan is also my second preferred destination. So that's a little bit about my connection and my interest to Japan. A lot of my friends have said that, Dean, it sounds like I've fallen in love with a country, Japan, but no particular person, other than, of course, my fiance. So I think I should come back to the topic at hand, right, about the shipping and logistics. Of course, if anyone has any questions about my travels, feel free to ask. So coming forward to what's happened in terms of the pandemic and the general kind of logistics industry. Okay, so to tie this back, if we think about Australia, for example, especially over the last few decades, a lot of our manufacturing has moved offshore, for whatever reasons. Maybe it could be the cost of labour, that sort of thing. So a lot of our supply chains in Australia heavily rely on imports. Now, imagine with the pandemic. So, what's happened there? Folks in many kind of countries being recommended, or in some extreme cases being forced to stay home. So, of course, there was the rise in home shopping or e-commerce. Of course, safety issues, staffing. Immediately, that had a big impact on sea or ocean freight. Okay, and the main challenges were about the container shortages, because due to the high demand in consumer orders, there wasn't enough cycle time to bring those empty containers back to the origin ports to fulfill the following vessels. Now, I think in 2021, it should have been around March, would everyone remember the incident in the Suez Canal? So that's when that container ship, I think it was the Ever Given, blocked the canal, and it took about a week from memory. So that one event itself had a massive follow-on effect for global shipping. Obviously, the backlogs. I know there were ships that were kind of next in line, and they also considered diverting their voyage to get to the destination. So that delayed a lot of the shipping schedules. There was also, a lot of port congestion. I remember in the United States on the West Coast, I remember pictures of literally, like 100 or more shipping vessels backing up, waiting to dock, and subsequent issues. Imagine those shipping vessels. I think there were stories they still had to maintain their engines running whilst they were at sea, potentially for days or weeks, and then the issues with the pollution to the environment, because a lot of those were diesel as well. But anyway, so imagine all these impacts on sea freight, the high demand, lack of empty containers, port congestion. Shipping schedules blew out from what would normally be weeks, potentially to months. And that also had significant impacts planning shippers, having to book their containers in advance. That really kind of upset a lot of trade. And subsequently, of course, there were significant increases to the shipping cost as well. So imagine a lot of traditional ocean or sea freight shippers, in order to fulfill their contracts, a lot then moved their traditional sea freight to air freight. And straight away, we know that's going to be a significant expense increase, right? The other double whammy, now when we talk about air freight, so that's my specialty as such, is we know that a lot of air freight traditionally moves via passenger flights. So it's all stored in the underbelly of the passenger flights. But imagine, as a lot of countries were closing their borders, that also meant a lot of the passenger airlines grounded their planes. And I'm sure we've seen, lots of images of hundreds, if not thousands of planes being parked. I think in Arizona, there's also a lot parked in Alice Springs, Australia, waiting to bring those planes back into the air. So that means, one, reduced air capacity, but also substantially increased demand for air capacity. So you can imagine that double whammy effect. Now, fortunately for FedEx, we operate these dedicated cargo aircraft. Earlier I mentioned, I talked about the 747s. Those were coming into Sydney twice a week. A lot has changed since then. So now we have daily flights. The aircraft has been modernised. We typically now run, for these long-haul flights, B777 aircraft, a lot more fuel efficient as such. But we were lucky, especially having a world network based on cargo flights. So for Australia and many other countries that we connect to, we were able to keep trade happening. But by the same token, yes, we've had the cargo flight network, but the other issue is the massively increased demand to get on those planes. So naturally, there were backlogs waiting to move freight as well. Okay, so that's a little bit about the background, what's happened with the pandemic. I guess the major issues that a lot of the shippers faced, back to the sea freight, the reliability, if not the availability of shipping vessels, that became an issue. Definitely the increased cost in shipping. For air freight, or the cargo airlines such as FedEx, we had daily flights, pretty much to every location. So it wasn't so much about the availability, it was more the ability to get space on board a plane to move the cargo. So those were the kind of major concerns. Now, a little bit about the connection, for example, Australia and Japan, that I'll kind of lead into as well. So imagine, especially from an Australian point of view, being an island nation, same as Japan, we rely on shipping as well as planes to move goods, in and out of the country. So one thing that the Australian government did, and this was, due to the COVID pandemic, was it was called the International Freight Assistance Mechanism, or IFAM for short. So in brief, what the government did was they negotiated with airlines and countries for key markets. Two things: they secured inbound flights coming into Australia to bring in the much needed PPE, the personal protective equipment, masks, sanitizer, that sort of thing, to come into the country, because in those days we really didn't manufacture much of this. And also on the outbound flights, assistance was provided for Australian exporters to move high-value perishable goods. Now, a lot of that, for example, would have been seafood, or various agricultural products that need to get to market, within a relatively quick time frame. So that IFAM mechanism, again, that was, instituted by the Australian government, really helped a lot of Australian business who I guess normally would have relied on shipping, but also bringing in all the PPE equipment. There was also, I guess we could say, a debatable trade dispute for certain Australian goods, and that meant either the demand for the goods was completely stopped or greatly impacted. So then those Australian exporters had to look at other markets to diversify into. So part of the learning lesson was over-reliance on any particular trade partners. So then market diversification was really the next, I guess, playbook to help Australian business, but also as a risk mitigation strategy as well. So then coming back to, I'm trying to keep this all as relevant as possible to the audience. So hopefully everyone's still following at this stage. So for my role, so in the last few years, especially due to the pandemic, I've been keen to help Australian exporters, especially for the economy, but also, of course, small business to help get their goods to market. A lot of what I've done and our business has been to provide training, really, especially for companies who may be new or have not even started their exporting, because definitely there's quite a few considerations to look out for. So over the last year or so, we've done quite a lot of virtual training classes. There's an organisation I'd just like to quickly mention for Australian exporters, the Export Council of Australia. It's a non-profit organisation, but their mission is to assist Australian exporters, and they do a whole lot of various things, from the training through to campaigning, with government as well, lobbying for support. So we've done these virtual training sessions, and fortunately now, as everything's starting to open up, and I guess day-to-day living relatively normal and safer, we're also doing, face-to-face training as well. So then through that, I'd like to share a few tips, a few highlights that definitely are considerations to watch out for. These kind of come from a bit of a playbook about all the things we want to avoid, the common pitfalls in exporting, especially when we talk about air freight. So a little bit more about what our company does. We provide door-to-door express deliveries. Typically, it's air freight. And so that involves a fairly premium product moving goods as fast as possible. So we know a plane can move so fast. Typically a plane can reach a location overnight. Or we also have a hub and spoke network, which I should mention briefly. Our hub and spoke network, I guess, very simply involves, instead of running direct flights between each location to all the possible destinations, the flights spoke into a centralized hub and then re-spoke out to the various destinations. So, for example, in the Asia Pacific, our major operating hub is in Guangzhou, southern China. So we have flights from Sydney that go straight into Guangzhou, and then they'll hub and spoke out to the various markets, for example, Kixin, Osaka, and Narita as well. So imagine planes can move only so fast, but the biggest issue that represents delays commonly resolve around customs clearance. So that's really the number one watch out, is about customs clearance. So really, if there's any one particular takeaway, the key word is research. Plan what you are sending and where you're sending to, and do a bit of research. Speak to the carriers, of course, but there's also trade advisors to speak to get the right advice. Imagine, for those who may not have experience in sending a package overseas or even receiving, it's a little bit like a traveller. We all have our passport, and sometimes we may also need to have a visa stamped to the passport, right? So for a package to move internationally cross-border, typically the documentation is the airway bill or consignment note, but of course a commercial invoice, which serves as the equivalent of a customs declaration. So just the basic commercial invoice itself, the information on that is key to avoid as smooth as possible customs clearance process. And often it's the assumptions about the product and the country being sent to that cause issues. So what am I talking about? The basic description would be things such as, what are the actual goods, a detailed description, what are they made of, where are they made, and what's the dollar value. Commonly, issues would be things such as parts, or maybe just writing samples or gift only, even though it might be a gift to someone or a free sample, but customs still want to know exactly what is it made of, where does it come from, and they may also be looking for dollar values as well. So that's That's an important one to bear in mind. Some countries, even for samples, they still might assess duties and taxes. So that just could be a factor of the cost of business as such. Another quick example talking about dollar values is, we've seen cases where a shipper wants to help out their consignee or the importer. So they might have a bulk shipment, but they decide, well, let's give it a really low dollar value so it doesn't go through the customs clearance phase. Now, sometimes that might work. However, these days, a lot of times it doesn't work. So imagine, let's say you've got a package or a shipment, 50 or 100 kilos or more, but if it's only declared at $1 or $10, typically that's a flag for customs, and quite likely they're going to scrutinise that, look at the paperwork. They might even open the shipment to inspect, which that could take a lot of time as well. And it's not our place to tell customs when to inspect the package. They'll work in their own process. So that's a bit of a challenge. The main tip there is have realistic dollar values. Customs are pretty smart about different commodities and what the market values are. So when they see that something may have been under-declared or misdeclared, good chance it's going to get delayed. Okay. Now, another quick one as well. Thinking about the different goods that are being shipped, there may be other bits of paperwork such as a certificate of origin. That could be an example where there may be certain commodities or even perhaps under a free trade agreement where the certificate is required. And I'll talk a little bit about that, I think, a bit later. If, for example, if anyone has food products or biologicals, medical or even cosmetics sending to the United States as an example, a definite area to research is about FDA, the Food Drug Admin, and potentially prior notice for food. The last thing we want is send the package, it gets to the destination country or market, and then expect the customs clearance to resolve itself. That's where a lot of pain will be incurred. And in a lot of cases, it really pays the effort to research, get the paperwork right before shipping, rather than trying to fix the issue, after the shipment has arrived. That's probably one of the key, lessons I've kind of had experience with a lot of customers over the 30-odd years. Get the paperwork right before sending. Now, what happens if the paperwork is not right? Well, definitely the goods can be delayed in customs. Depending upon the amount of time, there may be storage fees that could be added on top of the actual transportation charges. In some cases, the goods might also be returned to sender. So imagine a shipment could have a return, a round trip, the initial export cost to get to the market, and then the following import cost to return to sender if it didn't clear customs in the first place. So that could be quite an expensive transportation bill, and the end result is the goods end up at the original door, so it hasn't even left yet. Okay, so keep that in mind. Another worst case scenario is the goods may be seized or treated as abandoned, and that potentially could be a situation where the goods are destroyed. So we definitely want to avoid doing anything like that. Again, it's about the research, check about the product or commodity we're sending, what country we're sending to, because again, different countries may have different requirements, and get the paperwork right beforehand. Okay. Another quick topic I think I'll just quickly mention is harmonized codes. So I'm not sure if the audience are familiar with what a harmonized code is, but to keep it really short and simple, it's just a numbering convention to identify goods by the standard numbering convention as such. So imagine, depending upon the description of an item, there could be different interpretations. And I guess just a really quick example, let's say Crocs shoes. So if they're just declared as a pair of Crocs, straight away that might trigger issues with CITES, the Convention around Endangered Species. Is someone trying to send a pair of crocodiles, or is it the shoes itself? So having the correct harmonized code will help determine what the actual goods are for customs purposes. That'll also have an impact on the duty assessment as well. So that's something to research. And there's a lot of resources. There's a lot of websites to help look up harmonized codes. So that is another thing, to either speak with customs or even speak with your shipping carrier. How can I find what the harmonized code is for my product going to this particular country? Now, I mentioned duties and taxes. That's the second big issue. So apart from potential delays with customs, for example, getting the paperwork, not getting it right, missing information, that sort of thing, duties and taxes is the next big consideration. So there is a term, it's referred to as duty de minimis. It might be a relatively new term for our audience. to keep it simple, each country typically has its own threshold for the dollar value for a shipment for which duties and taxes will be assessed or not. Now, as an example, if we're looking at sending a shipment into Australia, so the Australian duty de minimis is 1,000 Australian dollars. That represents the cost of the goods itself, including freight and insurance charges. So that total value, anything declared below $1,000 typically is screen-free, meaning no duty tax assessment. Anything above, automatically an assessment, there's a formal entry, there's a fee for that, assessment of duties, and then the Australia GST. Now, there are some exceptions. For example, alcohol. Any value of alcohol imported into Australia will incur a duty assessment regardless of the quantity or dollar value. So just watch out for that one. So that was $1,000 for Australia. Another quick example, United States. So that's another fairly common market. The United States duty de minimis is $800 US. Whereas coming into Japan, imports into Japan, the threshold is 10,000 yen. So imagine different countries, different criteria. Now, there's a few other considerations as well. So that's talking about the duty assessment. There's also considerations about the tax assessment as well. United Kingdom, for example, especially Brexit, and this happened January 2021. Normally for the UK, if we're sending to the UK, the duty de minimis is £135. However, there may be cases where the UK tax, the VAT, is still going to be assessed regardless of the dollar value. So even if the goods are valued, let's say, £50, there may not be duties, but VAT could still be assessable. Very similar for the euro as well. So into the EU, the typical de minimis is €150, but also similar, VAT or the EU taxes can still be applied regardless of the dollar value itself. There's also implications to the shipper, especially in terms of e-commerce or B2C shipments, where some of these countries are making a mechanism where the expectation is the import taxes actually need to be collected by the merchant at the point of sale. Another quick example, for Australia and New Zealand, if anyone is doing e-commerce, selling online orders, B2C, to Australia or New Zealand, the GST for Australia or New Zealand, so the tax, that may still be required, again, regardless of the dollar value. It kind of relates to the overall turnover of business, the overall revenue sales. But those are examples where if we've got a website, so an online store selling goods to Australia, the expectation is the merchant in whatever country should be collecting the Australian GST at the point of sale, and then they need to register with the Australian Tax Office and remit the tax back to the tax office. So you can imagine a lot of administrative issues coming from that. So I guess it's a case of speaking to your shipping carrier to understand what the guidelines are, but also that you may need to research the tax authorities for whatever market that we're sending to. Okay, I feel I'm kind of rambling on a little bit, so anyone feel free to pause me if needed. I think what I can do is I can talk a little bit about the free trade agreements. So Japan and Australia. Sorry.
Moment.
May I?
Yes, thank you very much. Let's talk about the free trade agreements. That's very important too. But before that, could we just we have Jan here on stage, and he's obviously doing import export from Japan and into Japan. So and he has a question. So before we continue with the free trade agreements, let's hear Jan and his question. Jan, good morning. Thank you for coming up.
Hi, good morning. Thank you very much. I was chatting and posting in the chats, and Maya kindly invited me on stage. I run a e-commerce business shipping Japanese tea around the world. And at the start of the pandemic, we faced a lot of problems with postal service, which, as you know, utilizes passenger flights, completely stopping at the start of the pandemic. And I had tried to negotiate with DHL, UPS, and FedEx, and DHL was the only one who was willing to give us a rate competitive to the previous postal EMS rates at the time. And I was wondering, and the rate that FedEx offered was maybe 3 times what DHL offered, and therefore 3 times what the EMS rates were. I was wondering whether there was something that I could have done to negotiate with FedEx better. Considering that I've seen some of my competitors and other e-commerce companies offer competitive rates by shipping with FedEx. Thank you.
Okay, great, Ian. So I actually just had a quick chance to look at the chat message, and thanks for the question. I'm not. You can't see myself where I'm sitting, but when you mentioned, talking about the shipping rates, it's brought a big smile to my face. So I guess in some ways, to answer that question, a couple of considerations. So you mentioned that DHL were able to, I guess, acknowledge or offer a rate similar to the post to EMS rate. So that's great for them to be able to do that. So one point would be, what is the equivalent service that you were looking for? So do you remember earlier I mentioned that our business is typically door-to-door air express delivery, same as DHL, same as UPS. But within that, there are also a couple of different tiers of service, which typically talks about the transit time. So just make sure that we're comparing apples with apples, so to speak. Now, without, of course, getting into I guess what commercial sensitivities. Typically, there's two considerations from a shipping rate, I guess, negotiation, so to speak. One, and the most common one, would be talking about the frequency. So, yes, if there is a expected frequency or volume of shipments, that should qualify for a particular tier of pricing, relative to that. The other one is talking about bulk or heavier shipments. What a common phrase is spot pricing. So I don't think this may be directly relevant in Ian, in your situation. But the spot pricing, in brief, how that works is when there is available capacity. So, for example, if the flights are not full for a given period, maybe certain days of the week, there may be spot rates available, which simply means for a certain minimum weight criteria. Now, that weight, it might be 21 kilos, it might be 50, it might be 100 kilos. There could be an attractive per kilo rate as incentive to secure that bigger shipment to get on that flight. But of course, that's going to depend if everyone has a shipment that large, right? Coming back to the first point, Ian, about the volume part, I guess it always depends about the conversation you have, with the account manager for whichever express carrier. But definitely it's a case of being able to give a realistic projection of what the volumes are. But also we know that there's going to be a lot of cases where it might be a start-off business, and sometimes it's a bit hard to say, well, this is new business, so I don't have historical data to show projections right of what it would be. But I would say it would make sense, as long as you can kind of give some business strategy and give some estimate to what the business should be like, there should be a respective available tariff. Now, I guess in some respects, from a freight point of view, the account manager, obviously they're always trying to negotiate. Usually there's some kind of period that these contracts apply for. Normally it's a yearly basis, but you could always say, after 30 days, after 45 days, or whatever the contractual document states, ask for that to be reviewed, especially if your business has picked up above, whatever the original commitment is. So that is a consideration. In terms of, why are all the rates so different between all the different carriers? I guess that's a bit of a tricky one. Again, comes back to exactly what service you are looking for. Some carriers are very well known to offer extremely competitive rates just to get some volume, just to get some business, and then later on they may end up increasing the rates after that. So watch out for that one. I think the last one, Ian, is it may also relate to when you had that discussion. So if we're talking 2020, 2021, again, at least from a FedEx perspective, air capacity was extremely tight. So I can imagine, whatever pricing was available at the time would have only gone to a certain level. Whereas now, at least I know for FedEx, there are alternate options, especially for online orders. So there actually may be an attractive option as well. So if anything, in that last tip would be, even though you've had that original conversation, whatever period of time, it wouldn't hurt checking back again on, the FedEx, UPS, or whatever representatives to say, 6 or 12 months later, is that pricing still the same, or are there any new options that could be available? So that could be a helpful tip as well, Ian. So hopefully I've helped kind of give some insights into the pricing game and how to apply that as best as possible. I really hope so. Okay.
Interesting, very interesting. Thank you very much.
No problem. Thank you, Ian.
Yeah,
Okay, so
thank you, Ian, for coming up on stage. Really appreciate that.
okay. And hopefully, I can try my best to address any other related questions. Should I move on quickly? I'm appreciating of time moving on as well. So I'll quickly talk about the free trade agreements and then a last practical consideration on the physical front. So I mentioned between Australia and Japan, we have a specific free trade agreement. It's the Japan-Australia, I think it's Economic Partnership Agreement, or JPA for short. So that's a key one. So straight away, we know there's a cooperation between Australia and Japan. And in fact, most folks probably know a lot of countries do have individual trade agreements with another trading country or partner. Quick tips. Typically, the free trade agreements will provide market access. How? That's by providing preferential duty rates. That could either be completely eliminating the duty rate or perhaps reduced duties. It may also be phasing reduced duties over a period of time. So when we're thinking about free trade agreements, definitely do a little bit of research to see which agreement applies between the countries we're importing or exporting with. But also don't make an assumption, just the fact I'm shipping, say, from Japan to Australia, that my goods will automatically qualify under the JPA free trade agreement. So the best advice, have a chat if you can with a specialist customs broker or even a trade advisor. Now, a couple of quick examples. An Australian company would want to reach out to the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs, or DFAT for short, so they can explain the ins and outs of the free trade agreement. In Japan, I believe it's the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, METI. Again, they should be able to give advice about the free trade agreement. Typically, a carrier cannot assume, even though the origin and destination are parties under the agreement, we can't assume that the duties automatically will be waived or at a preferential rate. Usually, the documentation needs to give some reference. One, which free trade agreement, and also there may be some kind of instruction according to that particular commodity, how the agreement applies. So again, just don't make a general assumption that it's automatically going to happen. To add to the mix, so that's an example of the the country-specific agreements. There are also regional agreements. So this one's a bit of a tongue twister. One example of a regional agreement is the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP for short. So a bit of a tongue twister there. A more recent regional agreement is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP for short, and that one came into force early this year. Why to look out for these? Because under these regional agreements versus the original country-to-country, there may be different approaches, one, for the commodities that qualify, but potentially the duty assessment could also be different as well. So bearing in mind, Australia and Japan are both also member economies under the Comprehensive Progressive Agreement, the CPTPP, as well as the Regional Comprehensive Agreement, the RCEP. So again, best advice is if you're trading within a participating economy, again, speak to a specialist broker or again, one of those agencies, DFAT or METI as an example, to find out which is the best free trade agreement or economic agreement that your goods should be qualified under. So there may be different considerations there. I guess the last topic that I'd like to quickly touch on as well, this is from a physical point of view, is the packaging itself. So, one thing that, I love about Japan is the emphasis on packaging and appearance, right? So, that's quite a unique experience. When it comes to logistics and shipping, getting the balance in packaging is absolutely important. So, maybe not so much about the look of it, but the packaging itself. So we need to have sufficient packaging to protect the goods in transit. Imagine the typical path is your package will be picked up from your door or maybe collected at a depot, taken via a courier vehicle, whatever it is, to a sorting centre. The sorting centre may have various conveyor belts, moving the freight to certain locations. Typically, they'll be placed into a big container. These are the containers that go onto the aircraft, and then when it gets to the destination country, the reverse process. Offload off the container, go through some kind of sort system, and ultimately onto a truck. So there's a lot of touch points in the process. So that's the typically mechanical sort systems, but also on the flight itself. There can be turbulence as well. So depending upon the commodity, especially if it's sensitive or fragile, got to have enough packaging to ensure it's going to be protected in transit. And that might mean having an inner packaging box and various inserts as inner protection, that's a definite consideration because, again, damages may happen. But the other extreme is if there is too much packaging, there may be so much space taken up by the box itself. That could be a lot more than the physical weight of the package. So typically we talk about billable weight, and that would be when the volumetric or the dimensional weight is greater than the actual weight of the goods. And that could be a surprise in terms of the shipping bill. So it's about that balance, enough packaging for protection, but avoid having too much packaging where the package is taking up so much space, you're paying for a lot of air. So really look out for that one. A lot of carriers will provide free packaging. There's also a formula to calculate this volumetric weight. Pretty straightforward, but also note some carriers may have different ways they calculate as well. So definitely have that discussion, checking the actual weight of your package versus the volumetric or dimensional weight, because again, that can have a really big impact on the billing cost for the shipment. I think they're probably the key things. Perhaps the last one I just wanted to touch on, again, thinking about Australians exporting especially to Japan, a lot of agencies who are available to help to provide trade advice, they can also do things such as assessing export market readiness. They can also help identify which are the appropriate markets to target. And they could even do some kind of like buyer or matching or introductions. Ultimately, each company has to make their own decision on their own criteria who they do trade with, but trade advisors from different countries and governments can also help. So if I give a quick reference for Australia, Austrade, so that's the government body to help Australian exporters with export advice. There's also funding programs such as the Export Market Development Grants or EMDG. They're available for eligible Australian exporters. So having a chat to Austrade as an Australian exporter definitely is a worthwhile conversation. But also, on the ground in Japan, Austrade have a local team, as well as many other government agencies throughout the world. They'll also have local teams in Japan to help with the local business from the import side. So, for example, even if we have a business in Japan based who is looking to do business with Australia, it could even be helpful to reach out to the Austrade Japan team. They may be able to help provide connections and introductions with appropriate Australian business as a partner sort of matching exercise. Again, different countries, their own trade advisors will have local agencies in Japan as well. So it's something where the agencies are available to help the exporter for whatever the origin country, such as Australia, but also on the import side in Japan as well. Again, Austrade is a good example, but there are many other agencies to consider. That would be another conversation worth having to help on the trade point of view. Okay, well, I think I'm very mindful of the time. I guess there are some other kind of topics I could address, but hopefully that kind of gives a bit of a taste to what's happened in terms of logistics over the past few years, of course, with the pandemic, and also some considerations as well. So, Maya, should we take the opportunity if there are any other questions from our audience?
Yes, Dean, thank you very much for this briefing. It was really very well structured and listener-friendly. So thank you for it, for putting this all together. Jan, do you have any other questions for the moment?
Yes. There are frequently the tax issue is something that I'd really like to go deep in, but I'm sure there's not enough time for that. But very quickly, there are frequently fees related to customs processing. Is there a specific I know they can be also different for each country, but is there a place on the FedEx website where that is that type of information on fees is readily available?
Sure, thanks, Ian. Actually, that's another good question there. So yes, there are resources. So even on the FedEx website, if you can visualize under support and customs options, we actually have a tool where, imagine you can enter your commodity and look up the Harmonized Code, because remember that helps classify the goods. Enter things like the shipping weight, dollar values, what country or market you are shipping to, and that'll help estimate what the duty tax charges are. And then you'll get a bit of a summary. So then you can help build that into your costs, right? So definitely that's another good example of tools available to research what the potential costs, because often knowing the landed costs, which includes the customs charges, that's a good one to look out for. If needed, I think Maya will share my link in a little bit later. More than happy to have a conversation offline, or even, especially for the Japan-based business, if you're looking at exporting, I can also help make an introduction to the local FedEx Japan sales team to also give the local advice. Another quick one to watch out for as well, Ian, is often we may elect to pay for the duties and taxes, let's say on behalf of the consignee or recipient. So a bit of a watch out is to expedite customs clearance. All the carriers usually will pay the duties and taxes to the customs and tax authorities as soon as possible so we can get the goods released and out for delivery. But imagine when that happens, by paying the duties and taxes up front on behalf of the customer and then re-invoicing back to the sender or whichever party, often there is a disbursement or advancement fee. That could be a set amount. It could be, I don't know, $10 or $20, or a percentage, usually something like 2% of the total value. So that's another one to watch out for. Again, remember I mentioned about the EU and UK where the VAT is pretty much on any amount. So theoretically, there could be a VAT of just a couple of dollars. However, this duty tax advancement fee, for example, could be $20. So you're paying a lot more just for the billing of the duties and taxes than the tax itself. So watch out for that one. But yeah, coming back to the resource. So Ian, yes, there are tools available to look up duties and taxes. And as I mentioned, even on the FedEx website, it's called Global Trade Manager. Plug in your details and it'll help provide a total estimate for you. So I hope that helps in your situation.
Yeah, trying to determine those advance payment fees from per country has always been an issue, and as well as the other types of fees that customers might encounter. And generally, customers are perfectly willing to pay the fees up front, but they get very surprised when they see it, after the fact when the courier contacts them. So to be able to request those fees up front so that we can pay it for them would be really beneficial for our customer experience.
Definitely, Ian.
Yes.
Fully agree. That's often the big surprise. The goods arrive into the country and then the customer suddenly has this shock, more fees, and that raises the question, do they pay, or sometimes they might even return the goods, right? So again, definitely worthwhile to have a chat with your carrier to know what the potential fees and charges are. Great.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you, Dean, and thank you, Jan. I believe that we can continue this conversation in the near future as well, because there will be other questions, as Jan mentioned, probably, some people who do trade with the foreign countries are concerned about taxes and other fees. So maybe this is, a topic that we can talk about again. So it is 4 minutes past 9 o'clock. We usually have said goodbye by this time on a regular room. So Dean, thank you so very much again for all the tips you provided, and to everybody in the room. So the site, the link to the site with tips about shipping that Dean provided is shared in the room chat, so you can go there and actually jump straight into the site. So thank you very much again. Please stay with us next week. Come to the room next week on Wednesday once again. And, we'll be here. Otherwise, there is one more thing which I was going to announce. So Japan Expert Insights is organizing a networking event on October the 1st, Saturday, from 4 o'clock in the afternoon until 7. And we have 5 seats left. So it's going to take place in a Spanish restaurant. So if you're interested in joining us, please let me know either via the back channel here on Clubhouse or LinkedIn, so that we can have you there. So it is basically on the first come, first served basis. So don't wait too long before you let me know if you are interested in joining us. If you are, I'll send you the details, and that's it for the moment. Have a great day, and we're looking forward to seeing you next week. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for tuning in today. We will be on air next week on Wednesday at 8 a.m. Japan time again, so join us. Until then, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel. If you want to stay informed about our upcoming events, follow us on Clubhouse, LinkedIn or Twitter. Again, we are looking forward to your joining us next week. Until then, stay well and make the best of the day. See you!